Hey guys, I'm Steven.
I'm Vedika, and we're live from our respective homes in London and Delhi. Welcome to the first session of Future to be Decided, a podcast series that wants to help people understand and shape the future they want to inhabit by showing them how new age leaders and trailblazers think and define their future vision. So, how will we really do that? For each session, we'll bring together founders, investors, and researchers from different parts of the world with diverse backgrounds to share with us their thoughts on where specific industries, say retail, healthcare, financial services, are heading, what new trends do they see emerging, and their vision of the world of tomorrow looks like. And the most exciting part is going to be you guys are going to have the front row seats to seeing the future being created live. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, so today is all about the future of profit and purpose. So really trying to move away from the prevailing narrative, which is all around maximizing shareholder value at the expense of everything else. It's something that's really starting to feel at odds with the broader impacts and responsibility we're seeing organizations have, particularly in this kind of COVID-19 and what will become a post-COVID-19 world. So today we're really going to look at a bunch of things. We're going to dive deep into impact investing, understanding what it is, the types of organizations that are funded and the types of impacts that they focus on, look at the flow of capital to purpose-led companies and what it means for them to actually generate traction. And alongside that, we're going to take a very specific look at the future of waste management and the future of sanitation. So really understanding new models for waste collection and management and understanding different ways of utilizing the data that you capture from the waste you collect and what you can do with that going forward into the future to generate additional value. So hopefully by the end of this, you know more about impact investing, you know more about how to build a profitable yet purposeful business, and you get insight into some brand new business models which are being created. So that will be us today. Vedika, do you want to introduce Anirudha?
Yes. So Anirudha is from Calcutta in India, and he's a serial entrepreneur and has a bit of an eclectic background with experience ranging from finance, healthcare, and now waste management. He started in a more traditional finance world, working with the likes of Morgan Stanley and EY, and then shifted gears to managing a whole tea plantation in Bengal and Assam, which is, I think, spanning over 22 acres, if I'm right, and overseeing about 20,000 workers. So essentially mini townships. And I think this is where he got introduced to the concept of sustainability and circular economy, which eventually led him to co-found Recykal in 2018. And we'll be talking more about it today, but just to give you a snapshot, the company sort of raised $3 million to date and is looking to further raise about 10 million this year.
Nice. So yeah, Anirudh's our startup founder, and to match him, we have our impact investor Leo, who is currently an investor at Nesta, but has had a really broad spanning career, which has kind of gone from the working in development banks, a focus on total impact investment and measurement at PwC, working alongside the Department for International Development, and a bunch of other interesting things. But hopefully, Leo will go into lots of detail on you. I don't want to butcher the introduction too much. He's also a board observer for a number of startups, including one that is run by a friend of mine called Really check it out. It's great.
Before we move on, Steven, before we move on quickly, it was not 22 acres, it was 2,200 acres, guys. So that's huge.
Yeah, we are. Very big difference. Very big difference. But we have two interesting people with us, and I think that you guys have heard enough from me and Vedika, so I want to open the floor up to them. And I think a really good place to begin with would be understanding, I guess, your respective fields. So I'll start off with Leo, and I guess a bit of background for people listening is impact investing has become one of the hottest strategies in fund management. It's growing quickly. The number of assets under management is growing rapidly, and global impact investment is now worth over $500 billion. So a very, very big field. But I guess, Leo, opening the floor to you, what is impact investing and how do you define impact?
Thank you. So yeah, it's a good question. And I think one of the kind of starting points to frame the kind of broader field of impact investing. So essentially what it is, despite the fact that there is a multitude and many different strategies within impact investment, essentially it is investing for social and environmental return alongside financial return. So rather than being primarily focused on the extent to which a company is going to generate financial return, you see social or environmental factors as equally as important, but also mutually linked to the business model of the company that you're going to invest in. But I guess that may sound like a simple definition, but I think a lot of people aren't aware that within the field of impact investment, there is a kind of what they call a wide spectrum of capital. So if you think of impact investment along a continuum of capital, at one end of the impact investment spectrum, you'll have what some people call social investment, where investors may not necessarily expect much in the way of a financial return. They may just expect to preserve their capital. They may expect a little bit of a return, but capital preservation is the focus alongside a very significant social return. So not necessarily as focused on generating really high returns. At the other end, which I'd say is probably slightly more where I sit within Nesta, is looking for-profit, high-growth commercial businesses that may offer that kind of multinational, multi-million-pound growth, but by doing that, they're also generating significant scale with the social or environmental impact that they're trying to have. And I guess where that kind of complements, I think, the purpose of this podcast is that for me, where I work at Nesta, rather than seeing the social or environmental impact that you're having as separate and in conflict with financial return, we look for businesses where the social and financial are inextricably linked. So for us, kind of one of the key factors for impact investment is, can we find those early stage companies where they have true alignment between the revenue that they generate and the social impact that they're trying to have? And I think for us, that kind of fits within a slightly new paradigm of both economic thought, but also what we want out of a kind of capitalist system, which is, do we really want to be investing in companies that are negatively affecting society and aren't actually generating meaningful value for people and planet? So for us, we're not operating on a kind of subsidized model of investment. We're looking for high growth companies, but we're placing a bet that the companies that we believe are going to outperform other companies in the long term are those companies that think more holistically, more comprehensively about the value that they create and mitigate the harms that they may have. So just to kind of contextualize a bit further my specific role at the moment. So I work at Nesta, which is the Global Innovation Foundation, and the kind of mission of the organization is to support innovation for social good across different sectors. So I invest in seed to Series A companies within education, health, the future of work, and government innovation. And we're looking for those companies that hit that sweet spot of financial and social impact. And funnily enough, there are loads of companies that are genuinely committed to those things. And if you look at what's been happening under COVID, even if you look at mainstream kind of capital markets, which is one aspect of impact investing I haven't mentioned, which is this whole idea of ESG and responsible investing, which is where kind of mainstream asset managers incorporate kind of environmental, social, and governance factors into their investment screens. Those specific ESG and responsible investment funds have been slightly outperforming their non-responsible counterparts during COVID, which in many ways people are starting to say that this could be the turning point where both at the earlier and the later stage of investment, responsible investing starts to really overtake the kind of non-social comparables. So yeah, a bit of a long-winded answer, but hopefully that kind of grounds some of the conversation.
Good. I think off the back of that, before we dive further into it, it'd be worthwhile getting a feel for, Anirudha, you're running a full impact business, obviously a business, but is focused on both generating revenue and also generating positive return. It would be worthwhile getting an overview of the business as well, where it came from and how it is you see yourself aligning to those principles that Leo just outlined.
Right. Thank you. No, I think what Leo mentioned was absolutely, something really, really critical in building a business that is, and I think for us, we really look at Recykal as building a solution that is at the cusp of profit and purpose, because without the profit, it's really not going to scale up, and without scaling up, there is no impact, there is no disruption, and there is no a large scale effect that we're going to bring about. I think for us, we are now about 4 years old. I think we've kind of introduced and coined what we now think is W commerce, so waste commerce in India. Really, waste as a business, waste as a business has been going on forever. It's going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I think the aspect that we bring in is the transparency and the traceability towards supply chains of waste. And when we started off, of course, we didn't see this journey panning out the way it has. We could just see those 30, 40 meters that you see whilst driving up, a hill and through your floodlights. But what we saw was that there were specific challenges that stakeholders were facing, right? Consumers didn't have the right awareness. Consumers didn't have the right awareness and pricing awareness to dispose their waste. Businesses were generating larger volumes of waste, but they didn't know what to do with it. They were battling it out with the informal waste pickers and the kabadiwalas in India, and had no access to data and sustainability impact. Waste pickers, on the other hand, really were sort of forced into collecting waste from households, collecting waste from schools, colleges, and really had no access to a better life. I mean, incomes were particularly low, and really no visibility into how they could get on to the formal streams of living. For the recyclers, on the other hand, and surprisingly, you've got these large recyclers for plastics, for electronics, and for other categories. These guys are battling consistent supplies of waste, and even though we say that the circular economy is maybe a $700 billion market, in India we generate about 9 million tons of plastics, and considering that supply being a challenge for recyclers was a big shock for us, and therefore we realized that the value chain itself is broken, and there is some room to kind of bring in a digital disruption here. And I think that's where Recykal was conceived, and that's where we sort of started off with building platforms for consumers, businesses, and to see how we can use incentives to channelize more and more waste.
Can I just ask something on that? So one of the important kind of questions that I often ask myself when looking at potential investments is, as an early stage investor, I don't want to be investing in companies that are doing the job of the government or the state. As in, you don't want to be investing and therefore just letting government off the hook. And I have to be wary of that within, if I'm investing in education, health, GovTech, etc. I need to find those companies that are either supporting government to do their jobs better, or are enhancing, say, enabling teachers or medical practitioners in a way that is additive rather than displacing. And I guess operating in the space that you do, what do you see the role of the state? Is it a competitor? Is it an enabling actor? I guess, is there much of a kind of conversation that you have? Do you interact with the state? Is it completely separate? Do you have to interact with them? I guess, is it something that you have to deal with your company?
Yes, absolutely. And I think for us, the government is not a customer. The government is only an enabler. And I think the government really would be very happy to kind of get off the responsibility of managing waste, right? Because it's a big problem. And so for us, the government sets the directives, right? I mean, every state, for instance, in India has a directive that X amount of plastics should go to recyclers, or you've got to get your lands cleaned out of landfills, right? You've got to ensure that plastics don't enter the oceans. So I think it's just the government really comes in as a policy maker, and therefore really is the enabler for us.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
So for our listeners, Anirudha, it sounds like Recykal has a bunch of different solutions. One is a more consumer-facing one, like you talked about. And if I'm right, that app is called Used, right? And then there is a separate B2B solution, which is more of a marketplace that connects the kabadiwalas or the scrap dealers with the recyclers. So just so that our listeners are clear, could you quickly give us a breakdown of those 2 or 3 different things that Recykal does and what exactly those things are? Because given it's such a complex ecosystem, like you talked about, it'd be just good to get our heads around the different solutions.
Absolutely, and I'll just take a step back. So I think for Recykal, what we are trying to do, at a larger level, is to basically build a digital ecosystem, right? I mean, so a network for all stakeholders within the value chain. So this starts with consumers, on the one hand, who basically consume products and therefore produce waste. You've got larger consumers in the who are called bulk waste generators, like businesses, schools, which are nothing but aggregators of consumers. On the other hand, on the other spectrum, you've got recyclers who recycle waste, and in the middle, you've got this large body of waste processors, which comprise multiple stakeholders, starting from waste pickers to aggregators of waste pickers to larger aggregators of waste pickers to collection centers that process waste, so on and so forth. Now, out of all of these stakeholders, you've got the government sort of positioned somewhere as an enabler, really through their policy, through their policy for infrastructure build up for waste, through their policy for plastic bans, through their policy for EPR, the extended producer responsibility. They sort of really provide sort of the framework in which this ecosystem would run eventually. And I think for us, really, we in this digital ecosystem that we try to create, we really want to be, and we are the orchestrator, so that we have solutions that sort of touch each and every stakeholder. However, we sort of in this process generate a meaningful platform for the stakeholders to interact. So we've got 3 broad solutions within Recykal. One is the Recykal marketplace, which is really sort of positioning what we want to do with W-commerce or waste commerce, really provide a platform, a marketplace for the demand and supply of waste to be made more robust. You've got bulk waste generators, you've got the large kabadiwalas in India, these large aggregators of waste, to be able to sell their volumes of waste in an efficient manner. And on the other side of the marketplace, you've got recyclers who would purchase these aggregated volumes of waste. So therefore, the Recykal marketplace really is our first broad solution which provides these traceable supply chains of waste across both sides of the value chain. The second offering that we have is something that we call the Recykal Smart Centers solution, which is really a digitization and a SaaS offering that we have for government nominated collection centers. So again, government or municipal corporations give out land wherein you can set up processing capabilities and process waste. So we digitize these collection centers in India and enable the government with data. We also, of course, leverage the Recykal marketplace so that the supply chains of waste processed here can find better prices and therefore enable the livelihood of waste pickers, aggregators, etc. And the third offering that we have is what we call the EPR platform. An EPR, quickly, is something that is called the extended producer responsibility, which mandates producer brands, so Unilever, Procter and Gamble, etc. of the world, now need to collect their plastics, say about 80% to 100% of their plastics that they put into the markets, into the hands of consumers, back from the market, and to ensure that these to ensure that these plastics can reach recyclers. So it's this channelization activity that we have been doing, and we're also, in fact, the first platform provider for this service, thereby providing brands with transparency and traceability for their EPR obligations.
Can I ask, Anirudha, what inspired the kind of establishment of the company? Was it that you saw a system that just wasn't working well, or did you see a novel way of doing things? I'd love to know kind of what inspired the creation of the company.
So again, I think, when we started off with our B2C app. I mean, Vedika mentioned it's called Used, where we in fact empowered households in Hyderabad and Pune to dispose their household recyclables, dry waste. And I think it was something that we asked ourselves, right? I mean, I think that we as consumers never dispose our newspapers, right? Because we know that it's got a value. It could be a very nominal value, but it's got a value. And irrespective of our income, we don't throw it into the bin. However, for plastics, it depends on where you are in terms of your sustainability thinking. But kind of disposing plastics is a challenge, and you will find a lot of people who will just chuck that bottle into the bin because it's difficult to kind of store it, and it gets more and more complex. You talk about milk packaging, dairy packaging, right? If you don't clean it, you're not going to be able to keep it in your house. So it gets more and more complex, and therefore we realize that we know that plastics is recyclable, and yet we don't have the awareness, we don't have the right reverse collection system to enable consumers to dispose responsibly. And in the case of e-waste, all the e-waste is actually lying in our households. You'll probably have 5 phones lying in your home because you've bought it for, say, 500 pounds. Now you don't want to give it up for 30 or 40 pounds, right? So even though it's end of life, there is that consumer behavior that I might use it someday, which just forces us to keep it back. So we really looked at these 3 problem statements and try to see if we can use incentives, can use awareness to change consumer behavior. And I think about a year into this program, we had about 400,000 downloads on our Used app in Hyderabad and Pune, and we started seeing consumers, readily doing it.
Mm.
Right, it's really interesting. Really, really interesting. And I think what you outlined there is you had a really clear understanding of a complex problem and were able to weave a solution through it, which has worked really well. I'm going to flip it back to you, Leo, and go, given that so many for impact businesses are focusing on big, bulky problems, which often involve multiple stakeholders, as an impact investor, how do you understand these problems, and how do you understand the direction the organizations you're going to fund are taken to work on these problems are the correct ways in which they should be working? Are they working towards the right KPIs, for example?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of, so both from an investor and an entrepreneur perspective, often you will have, so with venture kind of investors, usually, I mean, it's not often the case, but often the best venture investors will have very specific sector expertise, so therefore understand the nuances of, so for example, if you're investing in health within the UK, if you don't understand the mechanisms and politics of how the NHS functions, and don't understand how the money flows, how the incentives works, understand where the bottlenecks happen, then it's very unlikely you'll necessarily understand what a good opportunity looks like within the NHS. So from an investor perspective, if you don't necessarily have that very niche sector expertise, then often what your job is figuring out how in 2 or 3 months' time you can become a relative expert on a very complex problem in a very kind of quick amount of time. And I guess for me, having started at Nesta about 1.5 years ago, working within sectors that I don't necessarily have 10, 20 years of experience within, each deal that I have to work on, you basically have to do, and I hate the term deep dive, but you have to do a kind of deep dive on a very specific sector. And part of the reason I love the job is because through doing that, you try and work out quite quick methods of understanding very complex problems. And I think for me as an investor, the method that I usually use to really understand these complex situations is, number one, you have to map out a landscape to understand who you need to speak to. So within education, for example, we do a lot of ed tech deals. If we're investing in a product that is going to be sold into schools, then if you aren't speaking to teachers from very different schools, then you're not going to be able to form a meaningful picture as to whether this school is relevant in a school in this environment or whether it's relevant in that. So for me, the kind of diversity of thought that you have to pick into is key. So you can't speak to one teacher and think you understand the use case or the value proposition of a customer. So for me, it starts from for kind of a very wide starting point where you think, who are the academic experts? Who are the investors that are active in this space? Who are the end beneficiaries? And you can never assume that a beneficiary is just a homogenous group. You have to understand that there are multiple use cases, and therefore speaking to very diverse groups is kind of fundamental. So I guess from an investor perspective, you have to be humble in the gaps of your knowledge and understand where you can locate expertise to kind of understand the value proposition. And I think the issue with early stage investing is that if you're investing in a company that everyone says is a good idea, then you're probably 5 years too late, because actually you have to be investing in radical solutions that not everyone maybe sense the value, but those that really understand the problem can see why it's valuable. So there's always going to be doubts, and you're never going to be certain, and you're always going to have to pivot and iterate as you grow. But it's important that you generate get as wide an input as possible and listen as carefully as you can to those that may think that the value proposition is flawed, etc. Because I think as an investor, you want to be knowing where the risks lie when you're investing in that company, and knowing that, through the conversations that you've had, that informs the strategy that you work with them. So I guess that's from the investor perspective. I guess often from a kind of entrepreneurial perspective, the people that have founded these companies have an acute understanding of the problem in which they operate. And if they don't, then you need to know that they have people around them that do understand that problem. Because I don't think you can just apply any technology to a complex problem and feel that technology is going to be relevant. I think there needs to be either a certain amount of lived experience or immersing yourself within a problem around those that really do understand it, because I don't think that expertise can necessarily just come. I wouldn't claim to be an educationalist. I wouldn't claim to be a health expert, but I would say that I'm quite good at now understanding who is an expert and understanding how to ask the right questions from a kind of investment perspective. So yeah, I think you have to be humble and understand the gaps in your understanding. And I think often there's a tension within both investors and entrepreneurs where you have to present yourselves as all-knowing, very confident, and if there are any gaps in your understanding, somehow that's a weakness. But for me, it's the opposite. When you are open and transparent in the gaps of your knowledge, I'm more likely to kind of trust in you as someone that will take both feedback on, but will also learn and gather insights along the way. And I think actually listening to users, experts, is kind of actually a component that's fundamental to impact investment. Listening to the end user, not creating a company that is developed and abstract from the people it's going to affect, I think actually is a really important part of impact investment. And in a way, in the same way that responsible investment is getting into financial markets, the kind of mainstream financial markets, the way that it's doing that is far more comprehensive reporting. So ESG reporting, environmental reporting, and that comes from being more rigorous and diligent in analyzing, assessing, and thinking about the interconnectedness of the things that you're doing. So I think a humility and a rigor in thought is kind of the key to doing it.
Nice, really, really nice. A question that comes to mind of what you've just said there. So I think you've given a really good example of how an investor can understand the space while remaining humble and ensure that they have a network of experts around him, including the startup founders they're working with, to understand new spaces and new fields. I guess, Anirudha, you're on another side in this equation. So from previous conversation we've had, I have an understanding that the impact investing space in India isn't as mature. So you go to kind of more traditional VCs to get the firm funded. How do you find that process of translating the facts, but you're building a business which is going to be profitable, is about driving financial return, but actually has this really big for impact piece embedded into the core of it. It is all about generating positive impact as well.
Right. I think I'll speak from my experiences for India particularly. For us, I think it was always about building a business for profitability, and I think given that it was in the waste space, we purpose or impact was a very natural byproduct. So I think for us, we have always considered and we've always reached out to the mainstream VCs in India and outside. And I think in India, again, impact investing is still pretty early. We're probably just about getting there, and therefore it still is about another 3 years, 4 years ahead. It probably could get a little expedited because of the unprecedented times that we're in, but we're still a long way before we can really explain what how do you juggle between profit and impact, and what do you do when you are tilting a little too much on either side.
Nice.
And I think so. Just to kind of build on that, one of the flaws that I think has been inherent to impact investment, and actually has often either put companies off raising from impact investors, but also damage the relationship between impact investors and their investees, is that often the kind of expectations of impact investors around the impact that a company should have and the resource that they should put behind measuring it has often been disproportionate to the size and stage of the companies that they've been invested in. So I think for us, if we're investing in companies a bit like Anirudha's is, where the kind of profit is kind of inextricably linked to the purpose, then having these slightly abstract conversations around whether you're a social enterprise or an impact-driven company is maybe a kind of false dichotomy, in that actually what we should really be doing, so for example, from the perspective of impact measurement, which is so one of the fundamental components of impact investing, is that you commit resource to measuring whether the impact that you're claiming to have is happening or not. But what we do, which I think is maybe slightly different to what other investors do, is we believe that most companies should be driven by evidence and they should be driven by data. And for us, we want to make sure that building the evidence base for that specific company and validating the impact claims that they're having is actually useful for them as a business, because it informs their strategy, allows them to collect data that is useful from a customer and kind of selling perspective, but also validates whether they are having an impact on educational outcomes, they are leading to better kind of health outcomes within health, etc. So I guess the kind of point that I'm making is that investors and companies alike should be trying to find those opportunities where the kind of impact and profit link, and that's both from a strategy but also from a kind of data collection perspective. And I think it's something that's often missed. And I think where I used to work before with DFID and CDC Group, there was because DFID funded CDC, and they funded CDC to invest in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia to grow the impact investing market. The data that we collected was really just reporting on the kind of scale of impact that we were having. So it was like the number of customers or the number of suppliers reached, and it would be disaggregated by income and gender, for example. That does give you some insight into the scale of impact that you're having, but that data doesn't necessarily inform each of the investee companies that reporting is about, in terms of, okay, if I know how many customers I have, that doesn't necessarily mean I understand how to tweak my product to better serve those customers. So is it a good use of resource reporting on this headline figures, or should you be reporting on data that that can actually be put to good use? So I think there's an ongoing tension there. And the amount that you invest in impact measurement will obviously be based upon the sector that you operate. So for example, within EdTech, 5 or 6 or 7 years down the line, you may want to invest in a randomized control trial to validate whether your tool is actually leading to better educational outcomes. However, you don't want to do that when you're 2 years old as a company and you're still growing. I think, you need to be proportionate in what you do. But like I said before, you have to be critical and always ask yourself questions and not overclaim with the impact that your product can have.
Leo, it's really interesting to hear that how measuring for certain impacts in the business can directly inform strategy and also actually even help improve the product. So it helps to continuously reiterate the product. But as an investor, when startups come to you, what are the key KPIs you're looking, you want them to show you? And what are the key KPIs you're looking to measure? And secondly, how do you look at what is exactly the investment thesis behind investing in certain startups versus not investing in the others?
Yeah. So I guess for us, like we integrate kind of impact and kind of thinking about impact across the entire kind of lifespan of a company. So both from due diligence all the way through to kind of portfolio management, broad engagement with those customers. But I think Nesta has a really useful framework for doing it. So at the due diligence phase, we have these 3 kind of overarching principles, which I think are really useful, and it helps us to screen particular ventures. And I guess I could just kind of shed a bit of light on each of those. So the 3 are around alignment, inclusion, and commitment to measure. So the first one around alignment, that really alludes to what I mentioned earlier. So we have to feel confident that the business model and the impact that they're trying to have is aligned. So a company that we recently invested in called Bibliu, at the core of what they do, so they're a digital distributor of educational content, mainly for higher education institutions. For them, their impact thesis and their business model is based upon this idea of inclusive access. So they want to have inclusive access to digital textbooks for students, just regardless of their socioeconomic background, because they believe that having access to content is a prerequisite to being able to engage in your academic studies. So for us, that ticks the box around alignment. And we know in 5 years' time, as they scale, they will still be committed to that. The second point around inclusion is we want to invest in companies that we feel are inherently inclusive in the products or services that they sell. So we wouldn't feel comfortable investing in a company that is only going to serve a very small, very privileged segment of the market, because then we know that the value that that company is having is both exclusive and inherently never going to be reaching the type of scale that we want. So inclusion is really important, and I guess inclusion will mean different things in different sectors, but that will factor into things around access, affordability, which I think is really important, particularly in the domains that we operate in within health and education, for example. And the third one, which is slightly looser, is around this commitment to measure. And for us, throughout the kind of 2 or 3 months that we may be performing our due diligence with a company, we want to assess whether we feel the management team is going to put time and resource into, as I said earlier, collecting the evidence, collecting the data that will evidence whether, for example, with Bibliu, is their platform inclusive? Is it more affordable compared to hard copies, etc.? And that commitment is going to require staff resource and staff time to put some thought and some kind of systems and mechanisms in place to make sure that they're collecting the data to kind of validate whether the claims that they're making are right. So that slightly looser kind of aspect of commitment to measure actually becomes formalized once we invest, because written into the investment agreement that we have with the company is a commitment to the social impact that they're having. So we come up with a social impact plan, a theory of change, which we co-create with the company. and that's written into the investment docs when we invest. So there is a legal commitment from that company to further the impact that they're having. And that isn't supposed to be a burden to the company. That's supposed to be something that has been co-created and something that's supposed to be useful in the long term. And the chief investment officer at Nesta often says to us, which I think is definitely true, which is, as soon as you have to bring out the social impact clause in the legal documents to get them to do it, you've already lost, because you don't want to have to be fighting them on that. And it has to, like, for example, we don't want to be taking up valuable time around the board table talking about impact if no one else thinks it's valuable. So before we invest, we'll speak to the co-investors, we'll speak to the board, and we'll make sure that they're aligned with our thinking, because our thinking around impact is very much business focused and business centric. And actually, at Nesta, we probably don't have as deeper pockets as other VCs, but actually a lot of companies see the value that we bring by thinking about impact in this way. So I guess kind of your second question around, the investment thesis, and how we kind of intermediate between different ventures. I guess kind of based upon those three principles, depending on how those companies kind of perform and score against those, that does perform quite an important function in how we choose the companies that we invest in. And I guess given Nesta has, there's about 350 or so people that work at Nesta, and we have research and kind of programs, teams that are super embedded in the sectors that we invest in, within health and education and within government. So whenever we screen a company, we always sense check the investment case against their deep expertise to understand whether we think this is really viable or not. And I guess, I don't know if it would be useful at this point to kind of talk about some of the companies that we're currently performing due diligence on, to kind of give a kind of view on the types of companies that would fit within our kind of impact thesis, which kind of sheds a bit of light on the types of companies that excite us. And I think they may shed a bit of light on the fact that there is this additional factor of impact that I haven't necessarily spoken about, which is this idea of direct versus indirect impact. So direct impact would be a company that is specifically, say, serving students or patients within a hospital. Indirect impact is where you as a company are, say, providing infrastructure or technology that enables systems to function, which then has an indirect impact on the customers or end beneficiaries. And for us, the indirect as well as the direct are both exciting. And I think there are two companies that we're looking at the moment within health, for example, which would fit that kind of direct and indirect kind of paradigm. So yeah, I mean, should I talk about some of the companies, or should we leave that to a later discussion?
Go for it. We'd love to hear about some of them.
Great. So I guess just to give an example of a company that we're looking at, which would fit this kind of indirect impact case. So there's a company which I can't name, but which we're really excited about, which basically deals with the management of metadata. So metadata, which is essentially kind of data about data, essentially, is a fundamental component for a chief data officer in an organization. They need to have a view of their data estate. And in order for them to do that, they need to have metadata. And the company that we're working with specifically operates within the health space, and they provide what's called a metadata management cataloging tool, which allows health data researchers to standardize their different data sets across different health data researchers, to enable data scientists to more easily and effectively perform health data research. So for us, that company isn't necessarily producing a medicine or a vaccine or a specific intervention for specific individuals that are suffering with specific diseases. However, they're providing the data, kind of back-end data architecture that will enable data scientists that are researching on these diseases to eventually create solutions and treatments for those. So for us, that's a really exciting impact investment, because they are enabling really sophisticated research on rare diseases, on performing research that is on groups that are maybe traditionally left out of research. And for us, although the impact isn't direct, it's significant because it's changing an entire system based upon kind of the more sophisticated management of metadata. So that is one example. Another company that we're looking at is specifically a skin cancer diagnostic tool. So they have developed a really sophisticated diagnostic imaging tool, which is informed by kind of a clinical study based upon very sophisticated machine learning that basically allows GPs and primary care consultants to identify whether something needs a kind of further a biopsy, for example, as to whether it's skin cancer. So for us, that's a really exciting impact investment, because both there is a systemic issue within the NHS, which is there are way too many kind of backlogged appointments for people that may have suspected cancer, and this is a tool that helps primary care physicians deal with that backlog, etc. So that's potentially going to have a significant impact on health outcomes. So yeah, there's a couple of examples that would fit our kind of impact thesis, but fit it within different ways, both directly and indirectly.
I think there was a lot wrapped in there in the last 5 or 10 minutes, but some really interesting learnings that I would like to highlight. Firstly, like the inclusivity, which is fascinating because usually social impact or impact investment at times suffers with the stigma that they might not be profitable. But when you actually look at it, because of the inclusiveness of the value proposition, the market size is much bigger. So the value pool that you're going after by nature is much broader than exclusive, probably just for-profit companies who might not be focusing on purpose as much. And additionally, looking at the commitment, looking at the measurements that for an impact company that VCs look for, they're measuring them against the impact that's created, profitability. It's definitely a way more rigorous business to run in comparison to a for-profit organization. And then finally it was also just really interesting to understand about the direct versus indirect impact, because direct impact might be directly related to the consumers, but the indirect impact might just be focusing on improving the infrastructure or the bases that sort of powers all the other impact organizations. So many fascinating learnings coming out of there.
And I think, Anirudha, your company is both direct and indirect, in that you're both reforming systems, but directly serving consumers. So it's a really exciting business from that perspective.
Right.
So I guess coming off the back of that, Anirudha, it will be really interesting to understand what the key KPIs are that you guys measure, how you measure them, and also how these have changed over time as you've grown and scaled the business.
Right, absolutely. No, I think first, Leo, I think that was really a fantastic, summary of the impact measurement tools. In fact, we've never looked at direct versus indirect so keenly, and I think it's really helped clarify things. I think for us, I won't delve much on the profitability or the growth metrics that we look at, because those are the traditional metrics that are out there. For our business, these are the metrics for impact that we look out for are very specific. So the first metric really is, in India, and this is all over the world, right? The actual volume of waste that is generated is just rising year after year, and therefore that number really doesn't hold much value. You know, we had 60 million today; it might go to 100 million in a couple of years from today. But the real impact, or the real question that one must ask, is that what proportion of this waste is going to get traced, or if I just ask it conversely, how much of this waste or how much of these plastics is going to replace fish in the oceans, right? So the first impact is really, can we start putting data into the plastics or other dry waste that can now be traced, as opposed to having no data previously. So for us, channelization numbers for plastics, electronics is one major impact that we look at. Consumer behavior and consumer awareness is the second very, very critical metric that we look at. And basically, how many students have we reached out to? So most of our awareness programs are run at schools, digitally and physically. So I think for the next academic year, we'll be running webinars. In fact, we've tied up with the United Nations Development Program in India, and we'll be featuring webinars and other web platform-based programs to enable students and empower them with knowledge on waste management, and hopefully with the intention of drifting consumer behavior. So a number of students reached out to potential impact collections, and then therefore a step further is how many students will enable their parents to schedule a pickup for their household waste, and will the power of incentives allow for that change in consumer behavior to happen, especially at a time like this? How many businesses will start selling their waste to authorized recyclers and authorized channels for waste collection? Another measurement that we look at is how many waste pickers are now going to get empowered, and what is the value of incremental income that's going to accrue to them because of EPR, the extended producer responsibility, because you now have funds, so you now have a Unilever that is willing to pay to collect its own plastics, right? And to do that, and you need to communicate that intent to the waste picker, to the state. And we've got difficult terrains, beaches, mountainous terrains, and getting plastics out of these places is a challenge. But communicating the right incentives and empowering the waste pickers ultimately leads into the creation of infrastructure. And therefore, we start, the next metric is the government now starts looking at CapEx, which they can allocate so that local businesses can set up processing capabilities to process household waste. And therefore, the entire ecosystem starts really building up. So I think these are really some of the impact numbers that we look at. These are all very, very focused, from a plastics and an electronics waste perspective for us.
That was really, really interesting, though. And what I liked was, it showed the breadth of your impact, because you were crossing across different stakeholders and impacting them in different ways, and also demonstrating the different ways in which the impact take form. So it may be psychological behavior change. Can we just get people to start changing their behavior in a way which will reduce the amount of waste, or at least change the way in which that waste is processed in the future? Can we actually empower groups of people and generate incremental income for them? Can we help organizations actually ensure that the products that they create, or the byproducts of the products they create, don't have negative impacts? So that was really, really interesting. As we're getting towards the end, we haven't got a huge amount of time left. There's a question that I have for both of you. Maybe Anirudha, you can start off, which is, I guess, from your perspective, building a for impact business, if you had to give a piece of advice to a young budding entrepreneur but thought they saw something out in the world which they wanted to solve, had a real societal value, but they wanted to build a business around it, what kind of advice would you give them? A kind of best piece of advice, and maybe something to avoid.
I think for me personally, it's really to validate as early as possible, right? I think to kind of have an MVP as soon as possible, and to validate what you're trying to create at the earliest is really, really going to be critical.
Nice. And then going over to Leo, I guess I'm going to ask you the same question as well.
Yeah, I mean, the advice I give and what I would say to avoid, they're basically the same thing, which I think if you have an idea, the worst thing that you could do is not to act upon it. So I think one of the kind of biggest hindrances for budding entrepreneurs is just inaction. If you have an idea that you genuinely feel passionate about, then we live in a time, both from a kind of technological perspective, but a kind of intellectual perspective, in that the technological and intellectual have basically aligned, in that resources are basically infinite online, although it's hard necessarily to find the right ones, that many of the barriers that existed previously have just been broken down. And I think if there is a problem or an idea that you have that you think can solve that problem, then you just need to start thinking deeper on the problem or the idea that you have and just start acting upon it. And I know that sounds quite abstract, but I think many people have great ideas, but not everyone actually believes in them enough to dedicate time to them. So I think the first thing that I would do is, with that idea, test that idea with people that you trust. Test that idea with people that you respect, because I think the more conversations you have, the more you test that idea, the more it comes to fruition. And I think once you've done that, there are so many resources out there on kind of business 101, kind of things out there that really can guide you. And I think often what I've heard from others is that having a really fantastic kind of mentor or advisor that you know has expertise or interest in the space that you're operating in can really be transformative. And I think often people that meet someone that is passionate and excited about an area that they have an interest in, they want to support and they want to help those individuals. So I think action, connecting with people, asking questions, and using the digital world that we have in front of us to access and engage with people that previously would have been impossible to engage with.
Great. So entering almost our last leg of the interview, we've talked quite a lot about data, and we know that data will play a pivotal role from not only just improving the products, but sort of creating a differentiation moving forward. And Anirudha, I know we talked a little about data and how data can help governments sort of better plan their capex. But in addition to that, no constraints here. But what type of data do you envision yourself collecting, and what type of insights do you see generating moving forward?
Right. So I think we're still quite far away from the point where we can start taking advantage of these what we call the data flywheel effects. We're still gathering data from individual stakeholders. It's still bits and pieces across the value chain. And I think till the point where we can start synthesizing this data and starts the data itself starts interacting with each other. That's the point when it's going to become more meaningful. I'll give you a few examples. So I think today we reach out to consumers and we start assessing consumer behavior, right? I mean, so if you look at, for instance, you're in Delhi, so a particular locality in Delhi would be consuming a particular kind of product and would be disposing a particular kind of product in a particular way. Now that information just becomes a herd, just something that everyone does without really realizing what different ways of a behavior change could be. And therefore, at some point, we would like to reach out to maybe a cluster of households, tell them that this is what you've been doing, this is what another cluster has been doing, and this is the impact they have reached. Versus if you just make this change, you will be able to drive X amount of impact. You not only impact towards your environment, but also a financial impact towards yourself. So that's one example. I think, and the same just accrues across the value chain, right? I mean, we can start looking at a particular state in India or a particular country and start assessing the manner in which various plastic policies, various waste management practices are resulting in a change of consumer behavior, are resulting in a change of behavior among students, right? And that data becomes valuable. I mean, we all speak of this, that it took about 20 years for the EU to reach where they are today, the European Union or the UK. So, I mean, we are at that point in India where we can wait another 20 years to get where the EU is today, or we can, leapfrog and kind of shorten that time if we can reach out and start using data and start therefore iterating what we've been doing so that we can change behavior sooner. So these are just a couple of examples. I think there's a lot more that you can do, and I think I mean, for us being at the center of this value chain, we would really want this data to interact with one another so that we can come out with actionable insights for stakeholders.
So talking about leapfrogging a couple of years and changing behaviors, I think one of the best examples of that would be COVID, and how that's like suddenly accelerated a lot of transformations and and helped a lot of organizations leapfrog a couple of years. So Leo, talking about COVID-19 and how it's really cast an eye on the fragility of many social and economic systems that we all rely on. I think you both will have a perspective, but starting with you, Leo, how has COVID-19 changed your investment thesis? Do you feel it's accelerated or dented the pace at which we're seeing impact businesses being formed or invested?
So I think for us, it has accelerated many of the trends that we've been investing in for many years. So, for example, EdTech, the digitization within education has been vastly accelerated as a result of COVID. So that is one trend that we have seen, I think, kind of leapfrog many years as a result of COVID. But I think though digitization is very valuable and very good in many ways within EdTech, I think in many ways it goes back to this question of data. Digitization should never be a displacer of in-person education and a displacer of teachers who are trained professionals that are the people that transform education for children and students beyond. So I think digitization shouldn't be an answer to everything within education. It should be an enabler where remote learning is a necessity, etc. So I think there is an importance of companies and investors who are investing in digitization within education to not just invest in it blindly and assume that digitization is a solution to everything. I think it needs to be one intervention in a much bigger, much more complex educational system, which requires many different inputs and many different, and also needs to be constantly assessed and evaluated. So within education, I think digitization is one trend that we've seen has definitely been accelerated. Within health, it's a similar story. So we invested in a company called QDoctor, which is a video GP consultation service. And again, that has become increasingly important because as the pressure on the NHS has increased, the importance of a proper digital triage service has become even more important, and to the extent that it minimizes and reduces some of the pressure that is being faced by the primary care and kind of GP world within the UK. So digitization is something that is clearly underpinning many changes and many shifts across all sectors. And I think there are great benefits to that. For example, the ability for people to remote work where it helps them to support their families, etc. There are always benefits, but there are also negative things that come as a result of these. And I think it's important for investors and companies alike to be aware of what those risks and possible unintended negative consequences could be. I think that's the early stage end, but where I hope and would like to think that the real substantial change also comes is from, given the reduction in carbon emissions that have come off the back of COVID simply due to a reduction in consumption, I do hope that this engenders a radical shift towards decarbonization within the kind of broader capital markets. And I think the fact that many socially responsible investment funds have outperformed, as I mentioned earlier, against many other investment portfolios across the kind of global capital markets has really hopefully shown, although there was data before this to suggest that they were outperforming in the long term anyway, that investors are going to increasingly move their money towards more sustainable and kind of carbon reduced portfolio holdings, because I think that's really where the big change has to happen. And I'm doing a bit of work at Nesta, which has a £450 million or so endowment fund, and we're working on thinking about how can Nesta have what's called a 100% mission aligned investment portfolio, where all of the holdings within that £450 million portfolio contribute positively towards Nesta's charitable objects. So I think, I think there's hopefully going to be a broader systems-wide reflection off the back of COVID about what's the future economy we want, and how are we gonna realize that. And I think I was on a webinar the other day, and someone said something which I thought was incredibly true. And she said, there simply is not a single intellectually rigorous argument to suggest that business as usual will lead to a prosperous future, because we cannot continue in the way that we are, and we simply cannot base our future economic growth on extracting more and more fossil fuels. So I hope that this is the inflection point where we really move towards a much more sustainable type of investment, both in the mainstream capital, later stage public markets, as well as the earlier stage. And I think, I'm hopefully going to be, working towards making that happen.
And we hope so as well. We hope so that your mission aligned portfolio happens sooner rather than later.
So do I.
Flipping over to you, Anirudha. So moving out of the investment thesis, how has COVID-19 really impacted your business? Things that you see will change and things that will remain the same, and the big future bets of your business not constrained by current limits or can do's.
Right. So I think during the initial lockdown, right? I mean, most of our ground operations were all shut. I mean, as we were figuring out, what the right move will be. So it was also a phase probably in India about for the first 70, 80 days, where consumers were actually piling up a lot of waste at home, and there was no efficient method of waste disposal. If you look at states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, even the NCR, where the impact of COVID has been pretty stark, we really faced the dichotomy, right? I mean, consumers who had built awareness towards segregation, who had started, who had committed themselves towards, disposing their waste regularly, couldn't find a suitable avenue to do so during COVID. However, it also allowed consumers, and probably by default, a lot of screen time and a lot of time to kind of read about what's happening, and therefore, as a company, we try to empower some of our audiences to learn more about how consumer behavior could change towards a better circular economy. But I think I really liked what I heard at the World Economic Forum recently, that with this great reset, we know that our vulnerabilities, our fragilities have been completely exposed, right? I mean, and therefore overall our systems need a reset, and everyone has got a role to play in this. And I think even in the circular economy, I mean, the transition towards a circular economy is going to accelerate much faster, whether it's going to be through increased awareness. I think a lot of that is going to be digitally done, but whether it's going to be through increased awareness, whether it's going to be through conscious consumption going forward, whether it's going to be through waste pickers and the informal sector finding a gradual transition towards the formal economy, I do see these aspects, of our value chain really building up, and that's what we really see accelerating over the next, say, 6 to 12 months.
I think just to add to that, I like the idea of the Great Reset, but I think, as can be seen with what's been going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, these things don't just reset by themselves. They require organized, collective response, which actually engenders change, rather than just assuming that things will change by themselves, because the status quo, as we know, is embedded within the systems in which we operate, in the same way that an unsustainable type of capitalism is embedded in what we do. So I think it requires, as you said, each of us to take a responsibility over shaping the future that we think we want to be seeing.
Very well put, Leo. Very well put. I have a question coming to you, Leo, actually. It's the final question I'm going to ask you today. And it's a very Peter Thiel-esque question. So where could the next for impact business be built, but enough people aren't looking at today, and why aren't they looking there?
So wait, can you ask the question again?
So where could the next big for impact business be built, but you think enough people aren't looking at? So It could be there's a massive opportunity through pulling carbon out of the air, yet for some reason, not enough young startups or people who are involved in engineering departments are focusing on this at the moment. It's just a random question to inspire
Okay.
thought.
No. I think it's a good question. So I would say, so one of the really big opportunities, and I think there are people doing this, but I'm not sure it's been solved yet. So if you think about the intellectual expertise that goes into working for mainstream financial organizations, whether it's JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, think about the minds that go into those companies. If a lot of resource and time was put in to kind of by those individuals to come up with better systems, whether it's quantitative, whether it's qualitative forms of kind of analysis, that truly measure, manage, and monitor the impact of their underlying holdings, I really think there is a significant opportunity within that. And that's not just kind of a slightly abstract, dry impact measurement tools. This is interventions that can measure, manage, and monitor the impact of big companies across public markets in a way that allows investors to steer them in a more kind of equitable and sustainable way. So I think it's a slightly kind of loose idea that I have, but I think there is a gap there, and I think that is a space that I would be looking at, and it is a space that I'm looking at the moment, which is, can we use novel methods for really understanding the impact of companies across the world? And the reason I say this is because we're trying to do this at Nesta at the moment. We're trying to do what's called innovation mapping. So we're trying to use, with our in-house data science team, kind of novel big data kind of analytics work to see if we can map the extent to which the public companies that Nesta have a holding within are negatively or positively contributing to innovation for social good. And because innovation for social good is Nesta's underlying mission statement, we want to see whether we can do that. And I think if we can do that well, there may be a really amazing company to be built off the back of that. Not to say that it will be a Nesta spin out, but I think it's an exciting space.
Really awesome, really awesome. Anirudha, I'm not gonna ask you the same question. I'm going to ask you to look out 10 years into the future, think about the landscape for waste management, and maybe give some highlights about what you think 10 years time into the future could look like if your kind of mission and your ambition for waste management comes true.
Well, I think zero landfills is really the first tangible outcome, right? I mean, today you've got large spots of land that are just, heaped with waste, plastics, etc. And you'll see this in India, Indonesia, Philippines, a large part of the world. So zero landfills and zero marine pollution. I think that's really now the zero is just one extreme, but I think those are, I think, the two broad goals that we have here. But to do that, I think the achievable goals that we're looking at is, as a country, all of us to know what our responsibility is. All of us to start off with segregate our waste, to know where we've got to move it, and what's the right manner in which we're going to dispose it. We have efficient and systems that kind of work towards processing it, and there is no child labor, and there ought to be no method of processing waste where someone is at risk, right? I mean, today electronics waste in most emerging markets are sort of burnt, and just you've got kids dying at 15 or 17 years just even before they're 20 in this trade, and therefore there's a lot of extortion and there's a lot of malpractices that's happening out there. And I think the entire intent of EPR is really to try and get these guys to to transition into the formal ecosystem. And I think that finally would be where this. So all of these are, I think, broad and very generic visions, but I think that's what we're working towards.
I don't think they're generic at all. I think they're very noble visions, but will create a much better future for everybody. I think people in emerging markets, as you mentioned, countries like India, countries like Nigeria, where waste currently isn't managed in the best kind of way. But I think there's a lot of lessons as well which come out to even Western countries and how to build better and more sustainable waste management systems. So I guess I just want to say thank you to both of you. I think that was absolutely incredible. We covered so much ground, and it's just good to speak, really refreshing to speak to two people who are focused on working towards really noble causes and making the world a slightly better place day on day. It's absolutely great. Venica, any thoughts from you?
No, likewise. I think it's our first session, and really grateful for your time, but more than the time, just like the amazing impact insights coming out of it. And the whole mission, as Stephen and I were discussing earlier, was to like inspire people enough that they sort of get out of what they're doing, their daily jobs, and get into something which is more purposeful, or join a purpose or impact investment firm or company, and somehow work towards a better future. So hopefully that mission today is like achieved.
I think you guys have done a great job of it. If
Yeah.
I was listening to this at home, I'd be feeling pretty pumped right now. Good.
Also, one quick plug, which is if you are an entrepreneur with a company that's looking to raise investment, we've got, I'm part of a group called Shaper Impacts Capital, and we're a global network of investors that try and support entrepreneurs to fundraise. So you can submit through the website, and we have a monthly newsletter which goes out to a global network of investors. So if that's you, either get in touch with me or go to the website. Shape Impact. Yeah.
So guys, check out the website. I will also include the link to the same on our blog.
Awesome. Right. Thank you guys, and have a great day, everyone. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Right, I stopped recording.